Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. And a very good morning to you, and you're welcome to today's Signpost webinar. We hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from today. We know that farmers and rural communities play a crucial role in protecting and enhancing biodiversity across Ireland, and inspiring people about the biodiversity around us is so important. And we're delighted to be joined by Calvin Jones, who is founder of Ireland's Wildlife website and author, and also advocate for biodiversity everywhere. And Calvin, you're very, very welcome to this morning's webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
And we're also joined by Dr. Keena, who's countryside management specialist with Teagasc. Catherine, good morning. You're going to help us with questions later.
Morning, Mark. Morning, Calvin.
So, Calvin, I know you're going to introduce yourself and your own background in your presentation, but just maybe to give us a sense of what inspired you to get involved in this area in the first instance.
I've been fascinated with wildlife for as long as I can remember. From a little kid, just a sense of wonder at exploring the back garden and turning over stones and finding all kinds of mini beasts, creepy crawlies we used to call them back then, but that's not deemed positive enough now, so they're mini beasts now. But yeah, just fascinated with everything, and I'm a very keen birder now, but it was birds that kind of caught my attention first. Obviously, birds are things we see every day, and then just getting into what are the birds feeding on? Why are they in the garden? What are they doing here? And watching their behaviors, and then getting interested in the other species that were connected to them, and it all kind of grew from there. Really, and I guess that childlike fascination never really left me.
Yes.
And given the situation we're in now, where we're losing so much biodiversity, that was a real catalyst to me, because starting Island Wildlife as a platform to share my passion for wildlife with others and try and get as many people as possible engaged, and to rekindle that connection that so many of us seem to have lost.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's kind of my motivation.
Connection with nature is something I think we all want to invoke, re-invoke. Catherine, I know Teagasc is doing a lot at the moment, and this talk today is part of a series of talks around biodiversity. What's happening in terms of biodiversity from a Teagasc perspective and agriculture at the moment?
Yeah, I think the last couple of years it has really come into its own. It's mainstream. Before this, for most of my career, it was biodiversity is nice, but we're into production. Now production is critical. We want our food, but we want to do it with biodiversity. So I suppose it's up to us to help. Simple messages there and clarity maybe on what's important, because while I think the problem with biodiversity is some people think it's simple and think they know, and they like one species and they go after it, and they don't know anything about the effect on others. So avoiding a single species focus, just being clear about retain existing habitats, number one, and I'm sure that'll come through in Calvin's. But I suppose I just have to keep reiterating the same basic messages. That's my mission at the moment.
So, Calvin, we'll hand over to you, and we'll chat to you after the presentation.
Okay, grand job. Right. Well, so welcome everybody to this presentation about inspiring people about the biodiversity that's all around us. It's something that I'm passionate about and have been doing for quite a long time. My name's Calvin Jones, and as I mentioned in the introduction there, I've been fascinated with wildlife all my life. For as long as I can remember. I grew up on the North Wales coast, so I'm a Welshman, just in case anybody thinks I'm English, a Welshman. And as I say, fascinated with wildlife for as long as I can remember. That fascination led me to the University of Liverpool, initially to study zoology, but then I ended up switching back to do marine biology for my degree. And that marine biology degree is what led me initially to West Cork, to a little island off the coast of West Cork called Sherkin Island, where I worked as a volunteer biologist at the marine station there. That was back in 1993. Now, as can so often happen, I met my now wife while I was volunteering in Shirkin, and then we travelled extensively before settling back to Ireland, first to Cork City in 2000, and then down to our current home down in West Cork near Rosscarbery in late 2002, and I've been here in West Cork ever since. So quite a long time now, I've been watching, recording, and sharing the incredible wildlife of Ireland's south coast with people, as many people as I can, trying to inspire them to get more connected with nature. I set up Ireland's Wildlife and the associated social media platforms in 2009, primarily as a vehicle to harness that passion, my own passion for wildlife and my experience of wildlife, to inspire broader engagement with the natural world with as wide an audience as I could possibly reach. And then as a natural extension of that, I started running guided wildlife walks here on the West Cork coast, and they developed into our popular Discover Wildlife weekends, which are run 4 or 5 weekends a year normally, where people come down to the West Cork coast and we spend the whole weekend just looking for and at as much wildlife as we can. And I also do some custom wildlife guiding as well, offering bird guiding and wildlife guiding services to private groups. So, quite a mixture there, as well as creating and writing content for the site. In 2013, I also joined the panel of the Heritage in Schools scheme run by the Heritage Council, and that affords me the unique privilege of visiting primary schools across County Cork and talking about wildlife and biodiversity with school children there. And that's an amazing experience. And I think if I inspire them a fraction of the amount that they inspire me, then I'm not doing a bad job. So it's an incredible privilege to be able to do that. So I guess to kick things off, what we'll do is I know everybody on the call or on the webinar probably already understands what biodiversity is, but I don't think there's any harm recapping a little bit and just setting the foundation. So what is biodiversity? Well, it includes in the name, really. Biological diversity is the variety of all life on Earth, from the smallest single-cell organism to the largest mammal. And everything in between. It also includes the intricate biological systems that they're all part of. So everything is kind of working together. Everything's connected. And I mean, here in Ireland, we have an incredible range of biodiversity. Here in Ireland, we have an incredible range of biodiversity. Let me just turn on the laser pointer thing there. So you have an incredible range of biodiversity. Everything from this is a typical single-cell organism here, tiny, microscopic length, microscopic weight, tiny little creature. In the middle here, we've got Ireland's smallest bird, a little bird called the goldcrest. Now, I'm not advocating you try this at home, but if you were to get hold of a goldcrest, turn it upside down and lay it out on a ruler, you'd have a fairly disgruntled goldcrest, but you'd also notice that from the tip of its tail to the very tip of its bill, it would be a maximum of about 8 centimeters long. And an adult goldcrest only weighs 5 grams, and 5 grams is about the same weight as a 20-cent coin. Or the same weight as approximately the same weight as a teaspoon of sugar. So a teaspoon of sugar, maybe like you put into your coffee this morning, just 5 grams, the goldcrest. And then on the right here, we have Ireland's largest species, and these are blue whales. And blue whales, the largest animal ever to have lived on Earth, does form part of Ireland's biodiversity. They're recorded regularly, passing through our offshore waters, well within Ireland's territorial boundaries. So blue whales, largest animals ever to have lived on Earth, are part of Ireland's biodiversity, which I think is an incredibly cool fact. It's wonderful. And according to the National Biodiversity Data Centre, more than 31,000 species have been recorded on and around the island of Ireland, with potentially many more still to be discovered. So for a small island perched in the northeast Atlantic, we have quite an incredible array of species. But why is biodiversity so important? Why are we here talking about biodiversity today at all? I mean, the very simple reason is that we can't survive without it, and we can't replace it. The biodiversity around us and those complex biological systems that it underpins are what deliver the fundamental conditions that we need to exist as a species. So we can neither afford to, nor do we have the ability or the technology to replace those ecosystem services that biodiversity provides for us. Now, various estimates put the figure at somewhere in the region. A conservative estimate would put the value in of at least 2.6 billion euro to the Irish economy every year is provided by biodiversity. So yeah, it's a pretty significant figure. But the truth is, we don't have the technology or the ability to replace those ecosystem services, even if we wanted to. And I guess one point that I will make here is that of the two major existential threats that humanity faces at the moment, climate change tends to hog the limelight. It gets a lot more column inches. If you check any newspaper, news website, recent political initiative, you're going to find climate change front and center. Biodiversity loss, if it's mentioned at all, is going to be barely a sideline or a footnote. I mean, even this Signpost webinar series is listed on the Teagasc website under climate change and air quality. So climate change gets a lot of attention. But while climate change is a very legitimate threat, something that needs addressing urgently, biodiversity loss, for my money, is potentially the more pressing of the two crises. Globally, we're losing biodiversity at an alarming pace. The current global extinction rates are unprecedented, and they're still accelerating. And according to the 2024 Living Planet report from the WWF, average wildlife population sizes globally collapsed by a staggering 73% between 1970 and 2020. Back here in Ireland, on a more local level, according to our latest National Biodiversity Action Plan, 85% of our EU protected habitats are seen to be in unfavourable condition. The status of 30% of our 60 EU protected species are also classed as unfavourable. Over half of Irish plant species are in decline, and more than half of our 100 bee species have declined sharply since 1980, with 30% of them threatened with extinction. And so those downward trends continue if you look at other species and groups, and that's a pretty grim picture. And if we allow that downward spiral in biodiversity to continue, there's a very real risk of undermining those critical biological systems that we rely on for our own survival. So whatever your viewpoint on wildlife and biodiversity, whether you're a real advocate or whether you're indifferent to it, from a purely selfish human perspective, it's imperative that we not only protect the biodiversity that we have left, but that we also look to enhance and restore it. One other thing I'll touch on here is that, I mean, while scientific studies give us plenty of empirical evidence that our biodiversity is declining at an alarming rate, anyone on this webinar who's more than a few decades old will have actually lived through first-hand experience of those declines. I mean, I'm in my 50s now, and when I think back to growing up on the North Wales coast in the 70s and 80s, I remember there being far more wildlife around generally. And when I go back to visit now, I'm genuinely shocked by how little wildlife I encounter in the hedgerows, in the woodland, and along the coast. And I've noticed similar declines in diversity and abundance in my 22 plus years here living on the West Cork coast too. But those memories of better times that a lot of us have, they're not necessarily the panacea for biodiversity that we often believe them to be. We set our perception of what's normal for nature based on our experiences, but we tend to forget, almost never even realize that the early experiences that form our baseline for biodiversity were of already impoverished ecosystems. So the biodiversity we experienced when we were younger was already degraded. So this is a phenomenon known as shifting baseline syndrome, and it describes the gradual change in societal perception of the normal state of nature, of the natural world, through the absence of memory, knowledge, or experience. What that essentially means is that each new generation resets the barometer for what a healthy natural system looks like, based on its state when they were born and raised. So it's kind of a shifting the goalposts, if you like, to what a healthy natural ecosystem looks like. And the reason I mention it is that it's critical that we take this phenomenon into account when we're doing things like setting targets for protecting and restoring biodiversity, to make sure that we set ambitious enough goals to make a material difference. So it's important that we aim high enough. So we've touched on some pretty negative stuff there for a talk that's meant to be about inspiring people to look after biodiversity or to engage with biodiversity. However, I think understanding the significance of biodiversity and the threat of losing it is important, and that in itself, understanding where we are and where we ultimately need to get to, can be a powerful inspiration for change in and of itself. But what about that more positive engagement? Essentially, inspiring people to engage with biodiversity is really about recapturing that innate sense of wonder at the natural world that comes so naturally to us as children. Children tend to have this innate sense of fascination and wonder. As adults, I mean, I guess. If you think back, do you remember seeing your first frog spawn? That amazement as the spawn hatched into tadpoles, and then that almost mind-boggling metamorphosis from tadpole to tiny frog. It's just miraculous almost. Or maybe seeing a butterfly emerge from a chrysalis, unfurl its wings, and take its maiden flight. Wonderful. Touching a sea anemone for the first time in a rock pool on the rocky shore, that sensation of the clean tentacles gripping your fingertip. Or maybe watching a column of ants parade along a predefined pheromone trail as they relentlessly ferry food back to the colony. And, I don't believe that connection necessarily disappears when we're adults. It just gets buried and suppressed amid the ceaseless demands and distractions of modern life. When I go to primary schools on Heritage in Schools visits, I find the boundless enthusiasm for the natural world, particularly in younger classes, contagious and invigorating in equal measure. It fills me with a feeling of hope that it's not too late to turn things around, and it reminds me just how important it is to inspire as many people as possible to rediscover that childlike sense of wonder and connection that so many of us have lost. And the good news is it's not that hard to rekindle it. It can start with just taking just a few minutes every day, consciously paying attention to what's happening right outside your door. Nature's chock full of the inspiring, the exciting, and the extraordinary. And it's often lurking in the most ordinary of places. All we have to do is remember to look. There's a good example of just how closely connected we still are if we slow down a little bit. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's very little positive that came out of it. It was a terrible time for everybody. But during the COVID-19 lockdowns, we were all, or most of us were, if we went essential workers, were forced to slow down. We're spending more time at home or close to our homes, taking walks, spending time outdoors. And with less of the time pressures and freed from the minutiae of daily life, people started to notice more wildlife around them. And the news reports were coming left and right about how a boom in wildlife during the lockdown. I think a lot of those reports were kind of misguided. There wasn't suddenly more wildlife around. Populations didn't magically spike through the pandemic. All that was really happening was people slowed down and started to pay a bit more attention. So we can reconnect quite quickly if we take the time to look. But how do we foster and encourage that dormant curiosity of the natural world in other people? Well, I mean, I found the best way to do it, the the most successful way of doing that is by sharing our experiences of wildlife and biodiversity online, or through sharing photos, videos, posts, wherever you can, or preferably in person. If you can show people wildlife and biodiversity out in the field, that's the real key to triggering, to reconnecting that kind of childlike wonder, that enthusiasm for biodiversity in them. And while rarer big ticket species are really cool, and some of the headline species on the south coast here that we try and connect with on our Discover Wildlife weekends, things like humpback whales, white-tailed eagles, basking sharks, or even elusive species like pine marten, red squirrel, other iconic species, they're always a massive thrill to see. And they can provide huge inspiration for those lucky enough to encounter them. But these encounters, they're often brief, they're unreliable, and they're infrequent. So to foster engagement with a broader audience and to inspire more people to reconnect with biodiversity around them, it's important to look a little bit closer to home. So, iconic species are cool, but so are memorable encounters with more common species that are all around us. And there's always inspiration on your doorstep. Encounters with common or locally abundant species, especially when they're augmented with an interesting or surprising fact or two, can be just as inspiring, just as rewarding. When we're on the wildlife weekends, I often ask people at the end of the weekend what was their highlight, just to give me an idea. And more often than not, even if we've seen things like humpback whales and white-tailed eagles, people will point to something much more a close encounter with a fox, or seeing a dragonfly hunting smaller insects over a watery ditch, or day flying moths, seeing mining bees burrowing into the sand down on the sand dunes. Smaller things can often have just as much impact. Helping people to engage with the biodiversity they're likely to see around their local area on a regular basis is likely to deliver longer term value and maintain their engagement and interest over time. So if you're introducing people to things that they can see regularly, they're going to keep looking, they're going to keep seeing, it's going to maintain that engagement over a long period. And again, that's the key, unlocking the wonder in the ordinary. It just means slowing down and looking more closely to reveal extraordinary elements in the more common species that we see around us every day. The other crucial thing to remember when we're talking about inspiring people about biodiversity is that the vast majority of the biodiversity around us is the little things that we often tend not to notice. If you ask any group of people about some of their favorite wildlife, or to talk about some of the biodiversity that they encounter, invariably the vast majority of people are going to name birds or mammals, or maybe plants. So birds, mammals, and plants are the three things that we tend to notice the most. And that's understandable. I mean, birds are very active, very vocal. We see them every day. There's plants around us all the time. You can't help but see them. Mammals, some of them tend to be, they're elusive, but they're quite big and obvious when you do encounter them. But birds, mammals, and plants actually make up a very small fraction of our biodiversity. Most of the biodiversity around us is the little things that we tend not to notice. This slide shows just three of my most memorable invertebrate encounters over the last couple of years. So this guy in the bottom left of the slide here, that's an animal it's an insect called the saber wasp, which is a cool name. It's a species of ichneumon wasp that is a parasitoid of insect larvae living on timber. And what the females of this species, this is a female here, they have this very long ovipositor. And they use this to burrow deep into the wood of trees, where they lay their eggs in the larvae of other insect species that are already feeding on the timber. So they lay their eggs inside the host larvae. Those eggs hatch. The larvae of the saber wasp then eat the host larvae from the inside out. They then pupate within the wood and emerge the following summer to start the whole cycle again. But an incredibly cool looking insect, wonderful, and a very interesting life cycle as well. And there are quite a lot of these parasitoid insects that go about their business unnoticed and unseen, but they play a vital role in keeping potential pest species under control by reducing the larval numbers of them. So, incredibly important, but also really interesting and really great to see. This guy is an elephant hawk moth. It's one of our most colourful and impressive moth species. People often think moths are kind of drab, grey, uninteresting, but we have a great diversity of moths in Ireland, and some of the larger ones, particularly the hawk moths, are incredibly colourful and vibrant. We don't get to see them very often because they are mostly nocturnal. But if you have a chance if you know anyone with a moth trap and you have a chance to have a look at some of the moths that they record, then it's well worth a look. And this elephant hawk moth is an incredible looking insect. These kind of greeny browns and vibrant pinks, and it's just an incredible creature. And then this guy is a very special species of gastropod mollusk. It's a kerry slug. It's a protected slug species that's found only in the southwest of Ireland and northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, so northwest Spain and central to northern Portugal. And that's a very unusual distribution pattern that's called the Lusitanian distribution that the kerry slug shares with a few other species, particularly plants. There are a good few plants that share a similar distribution. And they're not found anywhere in between. So they're not found anywhere in between Southwest Ireland and northwest of the Iberian Peninsula. So quite a curious distribution there. So very interesting things. But yeah, the key thing is to pay attention to the little things. This is a graph from the National Biodiversity Data Centre that they released in 2010, which was the International Year of Biodiversity. And it just shows, it's just getting a bit long in the tooth now, but it still shows the proportion of species from Ireland divided into the major groups. Of those 31,000 species that have been recorded in Ireland, more than 11,400 of them are insects. 8,000 of them are what are lumped together as non-insect invertebrates. So all the other invertebrates, all of the mollusks, crustaceans, arachnids, etc. So all of the other invertebrates, all of the other mini beasts, the non-insect invertebrates, 8,000 of them. And the next biggest group are fungi. This bar here is fungi. So mushrooms, toadstools, and their relatives make up more than 5,500 species of fungi. The biodiversity we tend to notice the most, the birds that I mentioned. This little bar here is birds, 457 bird species. Mammals, even smaller, that's down here. And even the plants, all of the flowering plants, the trees, the shrubs, the wildflowers, this is plants here. You compare that to the insects and the non-insect invertebrates, and you see just how important these little things that we tend not to pay attention to are when it comes to biodiversity. Together, these three groups make up more than 90% of all of the biodiversity out there. So they're incredibly important. So it's always worth paying attention to the little things. Another thing I'd encourage people to do to help to promote ongoing engagement is to keep and submit records of what they see. Keeping records and lists can become almost addictive and self-perpetuating. And adding new species to your list it can be a powerful incentive to get out there and keep on looking. If you know any keen birders, you'll know exactly what I mean in terms of adding species to the list. But it's a great way to encourage people to get out there and keep recording, keep looking. And then I'd encourage people also to submit their records to the relevant NGO or directly to the National Biodiversity Data Centre to help build a valuable, because all of those records collectively help to build a valuable baseline of biodiversity data that can then be used to inform policy decisions and conservation efforts going forward. Yeah, that's another great way to get and to keep people engaged. And there's a URL, a web address on the screen there that basically will take you directly to the Biodiversity Island or National Biodiversity Data Centre recording page where you can record your sightings there. They also have an app which you can install on your smartphone, and you can record things directly in the field and submit them, which is a great boon as well. Yeah, so I guess that's me coming to a close. I think I've actually spoken a little bit more quickly than I did in my practice sessions, so we're just coming up on 25 minutes. But I guess the key thing is, remember, the more often you look, the more you're likely to see, and the key is to get out there and look and share what you see. That sharing of things is the real way to inspire people to engage more with biodiversity. If you want to find me, you'll find me at islandswildlife.com. You can contact me through that, or you can check out the links at this URL here, and you'll find links to my various social media profiles and websites there. So yeah, thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to answering questions, having a bit of discussion around the topic of biodiversity now. So thank you very much.
Great, Kelvin. Thank you so much for that. Now, really, really interesting I love to hear the stories of these individual species as well. They all have their own little particular values, which we're always reminded of.
Yeah, and I guess sharing those little bits of information are the things that can kind of kindle that interest and make experiences sort of more memorable. They tend to stick in the mind, and you'll remember them the next time you see. And then you might then look up for other species. You'll be looking up for, I wonder what the life cycle of that is. If that wasp is a parasite of this, what does this one do? And it just that whole, it's almost like you become almost your own little nature detective when you start down that road, and it can become, like as I said with keeping lists and recording the species that you see, it can become a self-perpetuating phenomenon that increases your interest and engagement in biodiversity over time.
I guess there's so many factors at play. We have urbanization. We have all of these different factors that are maybe creating that divide between the nature and society. And you talked about the declines that you've witnessed in Wales and in Cork as well. I mean,
yeah.
What do you think needs to happen to try and seriously address those declines? Because I know there are soft measures in place and so forth, but what really do you think needs to happen to try and arrest that decline?
Well, I think quite a lot of stuff has to happen at a policy level, but there's an awful lot that can happen at a local and individual level as well. So as communities, as farmers, as landowners, there are small steps we can take that can collectively have a massive difference. Farms are a prime example. If you just manage hedgerows in a way that's a little bit more sensitive, allow them to mature, allow them to flower and fruit, because the number of hedgerows you see when you're driving around still, the government have acknowledged that we're in the middle of a biodiversity crisis, but there seems to be precious little action from the top in terms of enforcing policy to make a change. But on an individual level, you see some farms, for example, they're involved in biodiversity-friendly farming, who leave their hedgerows grow and fruit and flower. Those flowering hedgerows are incredibly important food sources for pollinators, particularly early in the spring, around about this time when a lot of our wild bees and wasps are emerging from hibernation. They've used up all of their food reserves. They need to find nectar quickly if they're going to survive and establish new colonies and survive through to the next generation. But there are precious little food for them if all of the hedgerows, because Ireland has this image as a green land, and which everybody associates with being good for biodiversity. But a field of monoculture pasture for a bee that's just emerged from hibernation is a desert that it has to cross to arrive at a hedgerow or a field margin where there are flowering plants that can provide it with that vital first shot of energy that it needs to survive. But if it reaches that hedgerow and it's been flailed to a nub with no flowers, that's it, gone. You've taken out not just that bee, but you've taken out the next generation, because these bees that are emerging are the ones that are going to carry on the species. And if you don't kill that next bee, you kill the potential for the future. So it's really vital. Just things like managing hedgerows more sensitively, and you can start small. Pick a hedge where if there's a hedge in a field that maybe you can't get the tractor in close to it because it's wet or boggy or whatever. Start small. Start with a small section where it's going to have the least impact on your day-to-day operations. Try it. See what happens. Look at what's there before you start. And then year by year, as that hedgerow matures, take note of what you're seeing, take note of what's happening. You'll quickly see that biodiversity starts to come back. Nature's great at bouncing back if you give it space and time to do so. Areas where it's not going to make a massive difference, leave slightly wider field margins. Don't go right to the edge. I think those are areas where policy can make a big difference as well. So, not rewarding farmers, or penalising farmers for taking actions that are positive for biodiversity, it doesn't make sense. It's not, but where a farmer is penalised or is rewarded for based on the amount of productive land that they have, and are not rewarded for maintaining and restoring habitat for biodiversity, that kind of approach makes no sense, particularly given the trajectory that we're on. So, it does need to be encouraged. But if there are areas on your farm where you can try and introduce biodiversity-friendly measures, even on a small scale, like better managed hedgerows, wider field margins that you leave, even something like mowing a silage field or mowing a field from the middle out instead of from the outside in. I see so many farmers mowing from the outside in. If you just go to the middle first and mow your way out, anything that's living in that field will make its way out to the hedges and use those corridors to escape. Whereas if you go from the outside in, you're pushing everything to the middle where it finally gets minced. Small things like that, which don't really have a massive impact on the productivity of a farm, but can have collectively a massive impact on rural rural biodiversity.
Okay. We have quite a few questions coming in from our audience this morning. So, Calvin, if we can, and it's amazing how the time slips by. So we'll try and get through as many of those as possible.
Yeah, sure.
And quite a few around that communication side of things as well, Catherine.
Yes, yeah, and just to remind people to keep using the Q&A tab there. And just to support Calvin on what he said about the hedges there, we're trying to make a major influence on splitting hedges into the two types, the tree-line hedges, which are allowed to freely flower and fruit and are never cut unless they're interfering with your way. And then, but still recognising there is a place for the topped hedge managed right, which is not being done at the moment. So again, there's a fantastic place there for the hedge, the managed hedge. So, but what we don't want is the one in the middle, the upside down toilet brush hedge. And so we're going to have a major campaign on that this year.
Yeah, and there's still plenty of those around as you're driving around the countryside. It's I was doing a little bit of ecology field work at a wind farm site near me in West Cork, and I was just last week, and I was on my way back, and there was hedge cutting going on, and it's fine in areas where it is infringing on roads and causing problems with visibility and safety. Cutting back the hedge a little bit is fine, but I can't see the sense or the need to pretty much destroy a hedge and take out any of the new growth and essentially cut it to within an inch of its life. And I struggle to actually understand the logic of that.
Calvin, can I bring you back?
From a purely, I mean, even not from a biodiversity perspective, but from a purely aesthetic perspective, if you're trying to make things look neat and tidy, and it looks anything but. It looks like a war zone.
Calvin, we've lots of questions here on a broad range of topics, so we'll try and cover a few different ones, along with a lot of compliments on your talk. But just one that, again, considering the weight or the number of insects in the total biodiversity in Ireland, what are your thoughts on their levels of conservation compared to other more popular species? And again, I'd add to that, apart from the conservation, how do we engage people on those invertebrates?
I mean, I think the key is really getting people to understand how important they are and what proportion of our biodiversity they make up, and some of the roles that they play in underpinning those essential biological systems that we all rely on for our survival. I mean, biodiversity isn't a nice to have. It's not something that we're keeping for its aesthetic value or so that we can have a nice recreational experience in the countryside. Biodiversity is essential to our survival, and natural systems have massive tolerances built in, but we're getting dangerously close to some of the tipping points where those systems are going to collapse. And if they do collapse, they can do so very quickly, and the danger there is that things will deteriorate incredibly quickly once we push beyond those tolerances. And the key, really, to getting people to more engaged with conservation of invertebrates and those smaller things is what I was talking about before, of finding the extraordinary in the ordinary, taking a closer look, slowing down, and sharing those experiences with people. I mean, some of our invertebrate species have incredible life cycles, and I mean, there's things like oil beetles, which lay their eggs on particular flowers, and butterfly flies in, and the larvae of the oil beetle that's waiting patiently grabs hold of its leg. That butterfly then goes and lays its egg in an ant's nest, and the larvae drops off and develops inside the ant's nest before emerging as an adult beetle. So there's incredible life cycles and stories to be told.
And I think you're doing your bit this morning by the picture you have behind you. Just following on the invertebrates, due to climate change, some insect cycles are changing. How to handle these life cycle changes? Have you noticed a change in life cycles or due to climate change?
There are changes that are happening, and of course, I mean, I mentioned climate change and biodiversity in the talk there as the kind of two existential crises that we meet, and that biodiversity loss doesn't get its due, if you like, in terms of its profile. They are linked. They're not the same, though. So climate change will drive biodiversity loss to a certain extent, but biodiversity loss is happening quicker and isn't just a result of climate change. And of course, some biodiversity loss will accelerate climate change. So they are connected, but they're not the same. And yes, climate change and warming temperatures and changing climate is having an impact on things like the emergence of particular insects. And the big problem you've got then is you've got this disconnect in timings. So, for example, everybody's familiar with the blue tit that nests in one of the birds that most often will use garden nest boxes. Lovely little blue and yellow bird. Blue tits time when they lay their eggs to coincide with what should be peak emergence of their favorite food, which is a particular kind of caterpillar. So they time it with peak caterpillar abundance, so that the young hatch at the same time when as these caterpillars emerge, so they've got plenty of food to feed their young. And what happens when things change? So some natural cycles are governed by things like day length. So these seasonal cycles are governed by day. There's various things that drive them, but some of the key ones are day length, which stays the same. That climate change isn't really having an impact on the length of on periods of daylight, but it is having an impact on average temperatures. So some of these cycles are governed by day length, some of them are governed by temperatures and climate events. So that you get a disconnect. You get these timings get out of sync, and that can have a massive impact. So it's important it's important to tackle both things, climate change and biodiversity loss, at the same time. And species are resilient. They've survived for millions of years because they can adapt and they can change. We just need to give them a chance to do that.
Yeah, sorry, I just moving on to just to try to touch on a few topics there. Our ground nesting birds are disappearing due to the invasive species mink. Any comment about invasive species and how we can deal with those?
Invasive species is a tricky one. They can cause a big problem. And I mean, the mink is a voracious predator that a lot of our ground nesting birds and small mammals and other species are not equipped to deal with. As a voracious mustelid predator that is equally at home in water and on land is a fairly ruthless foe. And I mean, I guess all we can try and do is wherever possible eradicate these invasive species because of the to protect our native biodiversity. The problem that you have with invasive species and some of the plants are key examples of this, things like Japanese knotweed, which causes a blanket cover and doesn't allow any of our native species to grow underneath it and spreads ridiculously. The problem you've got is, I mean, a lot of our native species will grow just as vigorously as knotweed, but they're kept in check because the natural checks and balances are all in place. All of the parasites and predators of those plants and grazers will feed on them. They have those natural.
Actually, it's probably important that we talk about invasive alien species or invasive non-native species, as I heard.
So there is a difference. But anyway, all of these invasive aliens, they don't have those natural checks and balances, so they don't have their parasites or their predators. So they run rampant.
I have a nice, an interesting one here about shifting baselines and how people's lived experience of biodiversity loss is based on an already depleted state compared to historical baselines. And I'm wondering if you have any good way of explaining this to people, as this person has struggled with it, and I identify with that. Adam, any comment about shifting baselines?
So. I mean, we tend to think of the biodiversity that was around, or the thriving habitats that were around when we were younger, as what is normal, and we set that as the base. I mean, that's the ideal. That's what we want to get to. But I mean, I'm in my 50s now. I know when I was growing up in the 70s, post-industrial revolution, post the, and the intensification of agriculture and specialization and all of that, that had already had an impact. Populations were already in decline, habitats were already degraded. We just weren't as aware of that. And every generation, it's well documented, it's happening again and again, is that we tend to shift our perception, our baseline of what's normal, what's healthy. So, my perception of what a healthy ecosystem is will be different to what my grandfather's was, because he was, he was around when he was around. Farmland birds were in every hedgerow. There were yellowhammers everywhere. There was there was just far more life, not just diversity, but abundance as well. Biodiversity, we're talking generally about species diversity and species richness. But a big part of it is also the relative abundance of species. So even our common species have declined an incredible amount. So there's just less around. There are less birds around. There are less insects around. I mean, when I was young, if you took a car journey if you went any further than going to the local shops, you quite often would have to stop to in the middle of the summer to wipe the insects off your windscreen because you couldn't see properly. That doesn't happen anymore.
Thanks, Calvin. Mark, do you want to come back in with one or two before I come back to the last couple?
Yeah, just I suppose a few questions there about people asking about the recent storm and where we had no electricity in many areas, and they were just really appreciating the wildlife around them during that sort of dark nights. And I suppose the question was around light pollution, and does that have a significant effect on birds or even nocturnal predators where we have sensor lights or street lighting, that type of thing?
It can do certainly. Anywhere where we're artificially changing the conditions in a habitat can have an impact. Whether that's a positive or a negative impact can be harder to judge. For example, yes, light pollution can cause problems for things like migrating birds, for bats that are hunting around. But I've seen bats hunting around streetlights because the insects are attracted to the light. So you basically have a superabundance of prey, which brings in the predators. And you have examples as well of things like in cities, for example, where there's quite a lot of light pollution. Things like city-dwelling peregrines hunt at night because they can see their prey silhouetted against the city lights underneath them. So prey species are migrating at night to avoid aerial predators, but the peregrines have adapted to hunt these migratory species because they're silhouetted against the city lights. So for the peregrine, it's a great thing. For the prey species, not so much. But our wildlife is adaptable. And things like common birds like robins, which sing during the day to defend their territory.
For those people, Calvin, that are interested in doing more, whether they're we've had a few people who have said they're not farmers, they're rural dwellers. Where would you direct people for more information about how to develop and Catherine, I'm sure you can answer this one as well. But just in terms of you talked about the hedgerows and so on, but is there are there a couple of good websites that you would recommend?
One of the best resources for information and guidance to improving your local area for biodiversity is the National Biodiversity Data Centre website, biodiversityisland.ie. They've got lots and lots of resources for different specific groups. So they have an area on the site dedicated to farmers and agriculture. They've got an area for community groups and individuals. They've got an area for schools, and the information there is tailored for them. On Highlands Wildlife, I've got various elements there about improving biodiversity in your garden, advice on feeding birds, advice on nest boxes, advice on various things. But the National Biodiversity Data Centre, if you want sort of downloadable information that you can action on a local level to improve biodiversity, then that would be my kind of go-to that I'd point people to. The
And Mark,
other
a
important
few
thing to
people have asked
remember is
about,
sorry.
Calvin, a few people have asked about the recording, and I know you're not in the Biodiversity Data Centre, but as a person who regularly puts in records, can you inspire the rest of us how easy it is and the concern that we're not putting in the right one, which will, or
Yeah,
identifying it correctly?
Yeah, I mean, identification can be an issue, but I mean, you can submit photos of what you see as well, which will help with validation. But yeah, it's quite easy on the website. You go to that recording page, and they have the various different recording groups that you can click into. You click into that, and it'll allow you to put in your species, the date, the number seen, and all of the it'll take you through all of the details you need to put in to submit the record. And then you can submit it. It's pretty easy to submit it, and you can submit multiple records, and you can have an account, and you can see what you've recorded. The other interesting thing you can do on the biodiversity recording site is that they have a map section. You can drill down into your local area and see what other people have been recording and what's been recorded, what biodiversity has been recorded in your area, which can be another interesting way to engage. If you find species that haven't been recorded before in your area, that's a great shot in the arm for your interest in biodiversity. If you find something that's new for your area, and it's a great, it's great. It adds to that baseline of knowledge that we have. So it's a very valuable thing to do. And in terms of identifying the species you've seen, it is. I mean, it's getting easier to do that all the time. We've got there are a wide range of field guides available. There are online identification guides and downloadable documents you can get to help. The Biodiversity Data Centre has these identification swatches, which are brilliant, that you can take out into the field. But increasingly, there are apps that can help you identify things. Now, you've got to be a little bit careful if they're suggesting things that have never been seen in your area. You can't rely on them 100%, but they definitely can help to narrow the field. So I use an app called there's the Merlin is the app for birds that gets all of the kind of traction. It's an app called Merlin by the Cornell Ornithology Lab. It's a US-based ornithology institution, but you can download packs for your local area, and Merlin will identify birds based on description, photograph, or their song. So you can record bird song, and it will tell you what that bird is most likely to be. But there are other ones that work for plants and invertebrates and other species as well. So it's getting easier with the help of technology to be able to identify what we see. You just do have to be careful and kind of double check, because sometimes they do get it wrong.
Okay, we're just up on time, I'm afraid. Thank you to everybody for submitting all of the questions. Unfortunately, we didn't get through all of them, and huge interest in this morning's topic based on the numbers of people attending. So thank you so much, Calvin, for joining us and sharing those slides, and keep up the good work. You're obviously getting traction, and that work you're doing with schools is really, really important about inspiring and educating that next generation coming through. Just before we leave you, I just want to remind everybody that the Teagasc FED Environmental Sustainability Awards application window is still open, and the closing date is now the 13th of March. So if you or you know somebody who you think would be eligible, why not visit that website on the Environmental Sustainability Awards section on the Teagasc website. Next week, we're going to be joined by Jesmond Harding, who's a conservation officer with the Butterfly Conservation Ireland, and we're going to be talking about encouraging Irish butterflies on farmland. So we're continuing that theme of biodiversity and protecting biodiversity. Catherine, thank thanks so much for helping with questions. I know it's hard when we don't get a chance to get through all of them, but lots and lots of really interesting questions coming through. So until next week, enjoy the nature that's around us all. I believe Sunday is going to be a good dry day, so no excuses for not getting out and about and discovering what's all around us. So thanks again, and we'll talk to you next week. You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.